The Earth is slowly dying. Even with the moon colony re-established and additional energy being delivered, it seems there is nothing that can stop total collapse. But then there is a message from a far-off planet, a spark of hope. One that might bring a family back together, and that could be the salvation that Earth has been waiting for. Or it could mean devastation forever. My name is Lile. Welcome to Lile's Indie Corner. We need to talk about Deliver Us Mars. Deliver Us Mars was released on February 2nd, 2023, and was developed by Kaioken Interactive and published by Frontier Developments. It is set 10 years after the events of Deliver Us the Moon, and continues the story started in that game. With the new protagonist Kathy, we go to Mars, and once again we need to figure out what happened and why she was called there. Right from the get-go, I want to say that Deliver Us Mars has impressed me with what a huge step upward it is from Deliver Us the Moon in every regard. I already really liked the first game, and I did not expect the differences to be as significant as they are. So in each section, you can just presume that I'm even more impressed than I was for Deliver Us the Moon. That starts with the graphics. While they were already amazing for such a small studio in the first game, this really blew my mind. The levels are so much bigger, there are so many more details, and it just feels grander.
This almost feels...
Alien? Looks like one hell of a science fiction machine, alright.
I have no idea how they managed to make such big leaps in 3 years development time, but they did. You can barely compare the two because Deliver Us the Moon is so much smaller in scope. Even though we know Mars as the reddish-brown wasteland, Kaioken understood how to bring variety to it all. Not only with the different buildings and man-made arcs, but also on the planet itself. While you won't find anything lush and green, there is ice in variations in color. It keeps things flowing. You never feel like you're in one setting far too long or far too little. And you don't get fatigued by looking at the same corridors over and over. The levels look fantastic. So much care was put into these. I'm still reeling from how big the difference is.
You know what this place could really do with? More barricades.
In my review of the first game, I complained about the camera, and I can say that they fixed that issue in Deliver Us Mars. I don't think I've experienced a single moment where I felt like the camera got stuck anywhere. So hooray for Kaioken! Most of the game is now in third person, with only a handful of scenes in first person. They made much more sense to me than in the previous title, and the transition also felt more effortless and smooth. Animations have also improved, even though there's still unnatural movement and a case of rubber legs, in my opinion. Kathy tends to be quite bouncy in her step, and her legs seem to have fewer bones than the average human. But maybe she's just very advanced in her evolution. The character models seem to be very similar, I think on the mission crew especially. They all had the same height, and they all moved exactly the same way.
What? What?
Nice.
That might be me being a bit too nitpicky though, I'm not 100% sure. This time around we do get facial animations. And here you can tell that this is not a AAA title. Lips move reasonably well to the voice acting, but when it comes to showing emotions through facial expressions, that is almost non-existent. It doesn't really matter if they are angry, concerned, or happy. They just always look slightly constipated. Most of the emotion is brought through the voice acting and the music. To me, that's fine. I know that this isn't a big studio, so I don't expect them to look like they are in a Naughty Dog game. It worked for me and it immersed me to the point that I really did feel for them, no matter how uncaring their eyes seemed. The only thing that could take me out of the moment was the hair animation. I turned on a specific setting in the options menu that I should have just left alone. It promised me realistic hair movements, but all it did was make hair go crazy all the time. But I forgave the game, because it is excellent. When it comes to sound, they only perfected what was already so brilliant in the first game. I would even say that Deliver Us Mars is more immersive than Deliver Us the Moon was. I think I was a little less impressed with the transitions from oxygen-filled spaces to hostile ones, but since so little of this game takes place in actual space but on another planet, I think that's just to be expected. But when it comes to the sound design in general, it feels so natural. There isn't anything off about it and it's not artificial at all. You do feel like you're in a hostile environment. Mars is not made for humans to live on, and you feel that. At the same time, everything just fits so perfectly. Like you really are walking on the sandy, rust-brown surface. The spaceships and habitats feel so right. I don't know how else to say this, but in the first game, you do sometimes get the feeling they wanted you to feel like you were in space and that you were driving around the surface of the moon. Here, you just are in a spaceship. You just do walk on the surface of Mars. It's incredible when sound design can immerse you into an environment this perfectly. The music is much more varied than it was in Deliver Us the Moon. It also feels more ominous, as if there was always a looming threat. And that is such a good emotional anchor for the story. It did connect to me much more than in the first game. And as I said, everything is just a step up from what Kaioken made previously. And I already love that. But still, there isn't like that one musical piece that I could point to and say, that is the sound of Deliver Us Mars. It is still very much a sci-fi soundtrack that we have all heard before. There's nothing musically that belongs to just one character or to one specific scene. At least that's what it feels like to me. It is definitely more emotionally impactful and it carries more weight this time around. But I wish there was a bit more that would make it unique to my ears. I'm gonna give a quick shout out to my editor, the Potato Witch. Thank you so much for all the help with these scripts. If you, dear viewer, are not only into space dramas but are also interested in JRPGs, you should really go check out their RPG recap video on Chrono Cross. Once again, we need to explore a foreign planet, and once again, that consists of a lot of walking, but also climbing this time around. Yes, Deliver Us Mars added a climbing mechanic that I am still on the fence about. I do think it's a fun addition to allow the player to explore vertically, but I'm not sure I like how it was implemented. It felt quite slow and at times imprecise. I died a lot while climbing. I don't want to hold that against the game too much though, because in most cases I was just very impatient. So that's my own fault, but it definitely does slow you down. I would guess this is intentional, to give you a bit of breathing space in between action sequences or heavy story beats. There was only one time when the game truly seemed bugged and I couldn't reach a ledge for the life of me, even after restarting the game. In the end, it was a matter of wiggling around and finding the exact spot where Kathy would be gracious enough to climb up, but that really got my blood boiling. Other than that, Deliver Us Mars gave me a really good experience. The changes they made felt practical and added fun. There wasn't as much variety in gameplay mechanics as there were in the first one, just more emphasis put on traversing and story. That was completely fine to me. It felt like a more cohesive whole this way. And while it is longer than Deliver Us the Moon, it took me about 8 hours to finish it, it didn't feel like it. On the contrary, having characters that interacted with each other and through cutscenes, it made it seem like it went by much faster.
I was as frugal as possible when designing this ship. However, I did splurge on one last-minute addition.
A window.
You're really ruining the moment.
Sorry.
The exploration also felt much greater in scope and scale than in the first game. It really did seem like Kathy and the crew moved around a lot, both on the surface of Mars, but also in a vertical direction when in the giant arcs. They also added a specific type of puzzle with these stream points, where you had to connect power in a certain way and sometimes with helpful tools, and that was fun enough without being frustrating. Again, having this repeat a couple times made it more of a cohesive gaming experience. While it felt like Deliver Us the Moon was experimenting a lot with different gameplay mechanics, Deliver Us Mars really honed in on a couple and made those a prominent and well-working feature. But once again, discovering what happened, reading a lot of notes and decrypting audio-visual logs was the main focus. And they just did it so well. I loved my time with Deliver Us Mars, and I kind of wish I could play it again for the first time and be just as surprised by the quality again. You should really give this a go.
Well, this is new.
Now, I'm going to try to avoid as many spoilers as I can, but please do note that it's almost impossible to talk about Deliver Us Mars without spoiling some things about Deliver Us the Moon. So if you're even marginally interested in that game, I recommend playing that first and then coming back to this video. Set 10 years after the Fortuna mission on the moon, where the energy flow was re-established, Earth receives a mysterious transmission from Mars. Could this be the missing colonists? Sisters Kathy and Claire, who recognize the voice of the message as their dads, together with Sarah and Ryan, are tasked with going to Mars to see what this is all about. The basic setup makes it sound like this is a mystery thriller, just like Deliver Us the Moon was, where Rolf first and foremost tried to figure out what had happened in the moon colony and if there was a way to turn the energy flow back on. You get a transmission, you go to Mars, you figure out what the hell has happened there. But that would be a gross misrepresentation of Deliver Us Mars' story. Because at its core, this is a family drama. The two sisters have very different opinions of their father. Kathy, who is our protagonist, is very excited at the prospect of seeing her dad again, while Claire is much more cautious.
I need to know that when we get there, you'll make the right decisions.
Claire? Kathy? Come meet us in the cockpit.
Kat,
I said I'd do what's best for the mission. So far, I'm doing just that. Right?
And Sarah, another crew member, has her own painful history with him. It sets up powerful dynamics that the game uses gracefully to build tension within the group.
You never intended to cause a blackout.
Having good intentions isn't hard, Kathy. Plenty of well-intentioned people have single-handedly caused so much destruction. The hard part is knowing the difference between what's right and what's wrong.
It works so well. The writing is such a huge step upward from what we got in the first game. If you have seen my review on Deliver Us the Moon, then you know my complaint was that the story was rather black and white. There were good guys and bad guys and not a lot in the middle. The sequel gave me everything I wanted in that regard. Nothing is easy anymore. There aren't any clear and right choices to make, and there are only people doing the best they can. Of course, some actions are painted in a much more ethical light than others, but with the different viewpoints of each character, it becomes much harder to tell if something is truly evil or simply necessary to achieve a greater good. Having fully voiced characters with facial animations is also much more immersive than the first game ever was. You're not just learning about what happened in the past, you're actually there with these characters, and you live through the moments with them.
Way off the planet!
Stop!
There is
Stop!
no way home!
Sarah,
That was our
stop!
last way to
Hit me
tell
straight.
we are!
Sarah!
We
Stop
are
it!
not going
Just keep
home!
holding yourself!
Don't you understand?
Sarah!
You truly feel for them, and you understand their motivations and their reasoning. We learn a lot about the Johansson family through flashbacks that are used expertly. They are peppered in throughout the game, but they never interrupt anything. They were placed perfectly.
I remember when he said that before.
Gave context to what happens on Mars, and gave us a glimpse into Kathy's mind and her understanding of her father and her sister. The voice acting performances really only enhanced this experience further. These actors and actresses committed fully to Deliver Us Mars. Since the facial animations cannot truly show emotion, they have to do all of the heavy lifting through their voices.
You are being a selfish and terrible father, acting out of your own fear and pain.
You have no idea what you're talking about.
Both know full well you are choosing to be on the moon for some inconceivable reason instead of focusing your talent and effort here on Earth.
I don't give a damn about the Earth!
And holy hell do they succeed. The game truly got me on an emotional level, and it even made me cry. And if you know me, then you know that that is the ultimate seal of approval I can give any game. If you make me cry, you've made it as a game developer in my eyes. I will love your work forever. And I truly didn't expect to be so immersed into the character drama. The first game didn't really have any of that, so why would they do it now? But I'm so glad they did. Maybe they wanted to do this for Deliver Us the Moon and simply didn't have the resources. But they definitely proved to me that they can tell a compelling family story on top of an intriguing sci-fi mystery. I love the first game because we don't get that many great space games. But Deliver Us Mars is on a whole other level. If they do make a sequel, and they are definitely setting this up to be a trilogy, I will pre-order it the day they announce it. Kaioken, you have a fan for life in me. Will you guys be picking this up anytime soon, or have you maybe played it yourself? If so, don't hesitate to talk to me about it because I have thoughts on the ending. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have missed it, you can find my review of Deliver Us the Moon right here. And don't forget, let's be weird together.